We work, we live, we innovate, and create. At the center of it all is your brain health. The ability to solve problems, think analytically, share empathy, and thrive.
We're trying to make brain performance really the next fitness revolution.
Scientific discoveries show that your brain can adapt and grow regardless of your starting point. The Center for Brain Health can show you how to transform your mind to work stronger and faster.
We learned from a national poll that 95% of people want to do something about their brains. The problem is they don't know where or how to start. At the Center for Brain Health, we have easy-to-use, scientifically proven tools to provide people a proactive path to do just that, to help people everywhere improve their quality of life through brain health. What's exciting is that it's easy to start, and starting is urgent because we are in a brain health crisis.
So how do you boost your brain power? How can better brain health help you focus on what's most important?
Brain training is a part of the way that we would distinguish ourselves from others. Quite frankly, I think it's going to be commonplace in businesses in years to come.
We are seeing an epidemic of mental health concerns. Stress and overload lead to depression, anxiety, and burnout. Our brains hold the key to navigate these hurdles. It's never too soon to start.
I think the greatest national security threat is pre-K through 12. If we don't take care of educating our young men and women, then we have to ask ourselves, where are we going to be in 20 years?
Research shows training middle schoolers how to think, problem solve, and innovate significantly improves academic achievement. Even more importantly, it enhances confidence and well-being for them to thrive throughout their lives.
It really helps the kid and it builds their stamina. I genuinely credit my success in the classroom from this program.
The key to the future is stronger brain health for individuals and communities. Ready to transform the world with us? Be a part of the brain health revolution. It starts here.
Welcome to Frontiers of Brain Health. And I'm glad that we finally have this gorgeous sunny sky back after several days of snowstorm and school closing. So my name is Yuni Lee. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Behavior and Brain Science here at UT Dallas. I'm an auditory neuroscientist by training, and I study the impact of music on cognition and language across lifespan. And I'll be moderating today's talk. Okay? So we'll have a few minutes of Q&A session at the end. For that, the virtual audience, please use the Q&A function. Okay? And we'll get through as many questions as we can. And by the way, this presentation is also recorded. Okay? So for those of you who actually don't know much about us, the Center for Brain Health is a cognitive neuroscience research center at the University of Texas at Dallas. We have dedicated the past 3 decades to exploring the neuroplasticity and the brain's amazing lifelong potential to get stronger and more better. So please stay until the end of the talk today to hear about our groundbreaking work, the Brain Health Project. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker. Dr. Claude Alain is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and a senior scientist at the Rotman Research Institute at Baycrest Center, Toronto. And I will say that Dr. Alain is one of the most respected auditory cognitive neuroscientists in the world who has published over 250 articles and book chapters in a number of flagship journals, including Nature, PNAS, Journal of Neuroscience, Neuroimaging, Hearing, and etc. Using various techniques such as EEG, MEG, and fMRI, Dr. Alain has addressed a number of important questions, including auditory scene analysis, speech and noise perception, auditory attention, and memory. Dr. Alain is also interested in how these processes change as we age and how that is impacted by experiences such as bilingualism and musicianship. Dr. Alain has mentored a number of students and postdoctoral fellows, and many of his trainees actually have become the next generation leaders, including my colleague Dr. Devin Biddleman, Joel Snyder, and many others. And personally, I grew up reading his article during my grad school time when I was dreaming of becoming an auditory neuroscientist. And his work has been greatly inspiring my research until this day. So with that, it is truly a great pleasure and honor to have Dr. Alain for today's Frontiers lecture series. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alain.
Hi everyone, and thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's great, and I'm sure you're glad I brought the nice weather from Toronto to you guys. So today what I'd like to do is try a little bit of convincing that the engagement in music activity might be a way to try to kind of slow down, mitigate some of the change that happen as we get older. So to start, I'm going to start right from the get-go. We're going to start with the good. So I thought I'd start with the good news and the bad news. So the bad news first is as we get older, things change, and they don't change for the better, unfortunately. So we lose typically a little bit of eyesight. Let me see if I can get the pointer going. Look like I'm not. So I'll go the old-fashioned. So we lose eyesight, sense of touch, smell, taste, and hearing as well. Today, some of the examples I'm going to give you with respect to music training and how it can help us, I'm going to focus on examples that are coming from primarily auditory perception. But we believe that the kind of thing that we see in terms of auditory perception and cognition can also transfer to other sensory domains. So not only we have change that happen in the sensory system, we also have a lot of change that taking place in the cognitive domain. So as we get older, our memory does not work as well. We tend to slow down. Reasoning is not as good. We make bad judgment, bad decision, and so on. However, it's not all the cognitive domain that go bad. One of the things that seems to maintain or even get better as we get older is vocabulary. So as we get older, we know more words. The only problem is that we don't remember them. And the other thing that we do as we get older is getting wisdom. And as you get older, then you have more wisdom and you like to share it. So I'm going to share some of my wisdom today. So that was for the bad news. The good news is that this slope that we see here, it's not fixed in stone. And I think this is probably the most important discovery that we made in the past 20 years, is that we can do something about it. We can have bad behavior and accelerate the change and getting worse, but we can also do things that will help us to mitigate, slow down the kind of aging process. And people have been very interested in the past 20 years in different type of way of doing this, and lifestyle choice can have an impact. For example, you probably heard that a good diet is not only good for your weight, but also good for your brain. Good food, good thinking. Exercise has been shown this tremendous amount of work looking at the benefit of being physically active in keeping your weight down, but also in keeping healthy brain, having improving memory, and so forth. If you are lucky enough to have the opportunity to learn more than one language and you're bilingual, well, this can have a protective effect against mild cognitive impairment. It can have a protective effect against Alzheimer's disease as well. Other activity, volunteering is good and increase your social commitment, well-being, sense of community, and also it has been shown to maintain some cognitive fitness. And for the older adult, we're now learning that certain type of game can help them maintain working memory function. For example, Mahjong or the bridge, if you play bridge. So, a wide range of activity that can help us in mitigating or sustaining some brain fitness. And what I'd like to do today is focus primarily on music and try to convince you that this is another way, if you're inclined to do so, that can be quite helpful, and we have been learning quite a bit about that activity in particular. So the general idea is that, of course, as we get older, we want to maintain cognitive function, and obviously choice and lifestyle will have an impact on that. We believe that music engagement, especially in early adulthood or in childhood, may enhance what we call cognitive reserve, which in turn, this reserve can help you mitigate some of the change that happen as you get older. And today I'm going to give you some example with one particular cognitive experience that most of us who are getting over the age 50 experiences, the ability to follow a conversation in a noisy environment. So what's so special about music? Well, you can think about music as the ultimate brain workout. It engages many brain area, the motor area, the auditory area, area important for executive function like the frontal lobe and so on. It involves numerous cognitive processes, learning, memory, and affect. It also has cognitive, physical, and social component. So it engages many brain networks that interact together. And you can think about music as learning a new language, where there's implicit and explicit rule that govern the music system. Now, the research has started primarily on young adults, comparing musician and non-musician. And I'm just going to give you a snippet of the work that's been done. I pick and choose few studies. Going over the literature would take a whole semester because there's been a tremendous amount of work comparing young adult musician and non-musician. One thing that we found that, or other group as well as found, is that your acuity, your ability to make discrimination in pitch is better in musician and non-musician. And that sounds like pretty obvious to everyone. I think you would expect that. But it's not limited to that. We also see that younger musicians tend to outperform non-musician in tasks that require temporal acuity. And here, lower performance is a better score. It is better discrimination. These benefit in terms of pitch discrimination, temporal discrimination, and so on, have been associated with some change in the brain of the musician. And you can see here on the red color is the musician compared to the blue non-musician. This is one way of representing neural activity. Below is what we call a spectrogram, where we can look at the power of different frequency band, and we can see around 100 hertz, which is the fundamental frequency of the speech signal that is presented, is strongly represented in musician compared to non-musician. And at the bottom here, I have another form of representation of the same data, where you can look at the actual peak power at 100 hertz, which is the fundamental of the speech signal. So not only we see functional change in the brain of younger adults, we also see structural change, which might be important to have this cognitive reserve. So we see change in the motor system, change in auditory area. We also see change in white matter that connect both hemisphere and the corpus callosum. Now, the study that I've been talking until now are essentially what we call cross-sectional studies. We're comparing two different groups. Now, one could argue that, well, people start to do music because they have a good auditory system. It's because you have a good, so it's not music in itself, it's just that you already have this ability. And to address that sort of concern, people start doing longitudinal studies, or randomized control trial, where we take people and divide them into different groups. This is a study where we compare children which were enrolled in keyboard, voice, or drama lesson, or had no lessons at all. And what was shown is that the general IQ, cognitive performance, was higher in those which were enrolled in a music lesson compared to those who were involved in drama and no lesson at all. So the take-home message is that these studies suggest that somehow being engaged or involved in music activity at a young age gives you some benefit that is not limited only to auditory function, but other things. And one of the things that we can wonder is, how does it work? How does it, and what we found, this is some work from our group and other group I've seen the show, seen the same thing. If you compare the brain activation of younger adult musician and non-musician, we found that, illustrated in green in this panel, they produce lower activity to perform at the same level of performance as the non-musician. So in other words, the brain seems to don't have to work harder to have the same kind of level of performance. So they are more efficient in some ways. This is not limited to a working memory task. It's also been seen for different another task where it involved speech processing. This is the activity in the musician, and when we compare to non-musician, you can see that there's lower activity in the musician. And again, that difference in activation is taking into account, we're taking as support for this idea of cognitive reserve that you build by practicing music. So in terms of interim discussion here, I want to just resume what I just said about the young adult. So music training enhances spectrotemporal acuity, speech processing, and auditory working memory. These kind of cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies as well suggest that musical training reveals neuroplastic change in auditory cortex, prefrontal cortex, and motor cortex. Now the question is, how does lifelong musicianship mitigate age-related decline in auditory perception and cognition? Does it have an impact? And one of the things I'm going to focus a little bit more is about listening in noisy environments. This is something that is quite challenging as you get older. For scientists who go to meetings, the poster session can be quite challenging, but you can also have the same kind of difficulties if you go out for dinner at a restaurant. So as we get older, hearing difficulty are nearly universal. It's extremely rare to find someone who does not have hearing loss. This is important because change in hearing function and hearing loss is associated with social isolation, depression, cognitive decline, and even dementia. When you have a hearing problem, you can divide them into two sorts. One is what we refer to as peripheral. This is when you have the cochlea that has been damaged through noise in normal age. That sort of problem can be remediated to some degree wearing an hearing aid, or if you have severe hearing loss, you may have a cochlear implant. You also have what we call central changes in the auditory system that are associated with age. And these can be corrected to some degree, we believe, with auditory training programs or with musical intervention. So when you study the impact of music training, and this is not limited to music training, can be seen for other type of a lifestyle choice, there's often two possible outcomes. One is what we call preserved differentiation. So this is, for example, looking in here would be you compare young musician and non-musician, and I show you that they were already different. And that difference may be maintained through adulthood. So there's no really difference. The other alternative is what we call a differential preservation. So the rate of change in certain function is different between the two groups. And this is important because only when you have differential preservation do you have an indication of a protective effect of the expertise on cognitive function, because it had this additive benefit of experience over time. So we went to test this idea a number of years ago with Ben Zendel, who's a former graduate student of mine, who's now at Memorial University. And he compared 74 musicians and 89 non-musicians with age varying from 19 or 18 to 91. And what he found, he gave these people 4 different tasks. One was simply measuring their hearing sensitivity. So this is simply asking them, can you hear the sound or not? It's a pure tone threshold. And what you should take out of this slide essentially is that their hearing sensitivity declined to the same rate in both populations. So at the peripheral level, there's no difference. They are the same. If anything, we could have expected more hearing loss in the musician because they're often exposed to more noise than the non-musician. When we look at the frequency acuity, what we found is indication of a preserved differentiation. Again, at the early age, like I've shown in the previous slide, it seems musician outperformed the non-musician. And that difference is maintained overall to adulthood. So in terms of their frequency acuity, there's not much change that happen over time. What about temporal acuity? And this is using a gap detection threshold. And what we found here is indication of a differential preservation. Okay, this is a case where there's some differences, they're not that big, but these differences tend to accentuate with a greater decline, meaning you need more difference in the gap in order to detect it as you get older. Now you can appreciate that this 3 data point, I put a little bit outlier out there, and these data points, if we remove them, we still find a significant difference between the two slopes. Now, this is nice, but this is relatively simple type of perceptual processes. What about something a little bit more cognitive, something that we encounter every day? So this is, we use a speech and noise test and ask them whether they can detect or recognize the speech and noise. And what we found there is an indication, again, of preserved differentiation. Now, you can appreciate that the slope are they're not that different. And you may say, well, that doesn't seem to be a big deal. Well, if you take the hearing of a musician that is 60 years old, 68 years old approximately, and you compare to that of a non-musician, well, that non-musician would be about, would be 48 years old, not a non-musician. Yes, he's a non-musician. So what is, this is what I'm trying to show you here, to convince you, is that playing a musical instrument is as if it's buying you about 20 years of good listening skill. So if you think you're going to the restaurant or you're going to the poster session, if you were an ongoing musician, you would do quite better compared to the non-musician. These benefits are not limited to auditory domain. We see benefit also in the visual task. This is a go, no-go task. They have to withhold a response when they see this pink shape. In terms of the go trial, we have to press the key. We don't see much of a difference between musician and non-musician. But when we look at those no-go where they have to withhold the response, the non-musician, and those are older adults, they tend to make more errors than the non-musician. And these differences that we see in terms of performance have been associated with some change in cognitive event-related potential that index more cognitive processes. Now, this is recent data that just came out about in the past 3 to 4 months from a different group who are looking at different type of cognitive domain, global measure, memory, working memory, executive function, language, and visual function. And they found that in many cases, the older musician outperformed the non-musician. Now, there seems to be what we call a dose effect of this benefit. That's not been studied extensively, but there's some indication that's the case out there. This is a study that was published by Anna Vladi and McKay in 2011, and what she did is compare people who have no music training, have between low activity, which was defined between 1 and 9 years of music activity or training, or 9+. And what you can see is there's a linear kind of change in almost 4 different tasks, cognitive tasks, with the musician who has a higher level of activity doing better than those who have low or no engagement in music training or activity. So, what I've said so far is that musician and non-musician, they show comparable age-related peripheral hearing loss as measured with glottonodometry. So the sensation is not different. The peripheral information getting in is not better or worse in musician. It's the central auditory system that seems to be the difference. So musicians show slower age-related decline in understanding speech and noise, and it also generalized to other things. They also show better performance in cognitive tasks comparatively to non-musicians. Now, the question that we became interested after this work was to what extent or how does the music training mitigate the change in auditory cognition? We started thinking that, well, maybe the music training, this idea of cognitive reserve is doing something in the ascending auditory pathway in the way that musicians or those who have received music training are better able to encode sensory information. And by that better improvement in sensory representation, then that would release some of the cognitive resource that you have, because you have a good signal to work with. So we call that kind of a more bottom-up type of hypothesis. An alternative to that, a little bit obvious, but would be that older musicians, they are better at engaging some compensatory strategy. They're better listeners to overcome the kind of a sensory loss that we experience as we get older. And of course, you can have a mix of the two possibilities together. So in order to test or to explore these kind of questions, we use auditory event-related potential because in part they allow us to track neural activity coming from the lower auditory center, brainstem, and so on, all the way to the auditory cortex. That way we can have a sense at what level, maybe in the auditory system, music training may start to impact performance. The study that I'm going to show, a study that was done with older adults, by the way. So we're using a technique that was developed with Gavin Bittleman, a former postdoc of mine, in which we measure EEG using a large density EEG system, and we present them with speech signal, and we record with a very high rate digital processing so that we can have a very fine resolution of the EEG and see whether we can track the speech. But we also look at the more slow wave that are more associated with cognitive function. Now, we apply different technique, filtering, processing technique to extract one type of waveform that we call frequency following response, that is a representation of the speech signal that is thought to be coming from primarily from lower auditory center. And we also measure cortical evoked response that are generated around 100 and plus milliseconds after the sound onset. And these are thought to be, like I said, originating brainstem versus the cortical cortex. And using that sort of technique, what we can do is, this is data from a different project, but it's just to show you how we can quantify the data. So you have, again, this kind of representation where you overlay the waveform. You can see that the musician has a little bit larger amplitude. We can quantify that amplitude in bar graph. We can extract the timing of the response and see whether the timing is tighter or better in one group versus another. And then we can take these measurements and correlate them with the number of years of experience, for example, in terms of playing a musical instrument. So it gives us a way of looking at different things in these two group of participants. So in the project that we did, we have 5 different stimuli valve, in fact, and we manipulate the first formant, which is one that induces a shift in your categorical perception or perception of the vowel. So in one setting, you hear the vowel as a U. In a different setting, when you have more separation, more difference in F1, you hear the vowel as an A. So a very small, I should say, a very relatively small difference, acoustically speaking, but quite a strong difference perceptually. And when we look at their actual perception, how they hear these vowels, well, we didn't find much of a difference between the two groups. On one extreme, you hear the vowel as a U, and as you increase the fundamental, the first formant, you start to see a shift in perception, and you hear the vowel as a H. It's not much of a surprise in there. When we look at the reaction time, however, we see quite a bit of a difference. First of all, we see that our musicians are quite faster than the non-musician in making those judgments, those classifications. And we also see a slowing in the response, which is anticipated and well described when the vowel is a little bit more ambiguous. When you have this first formant that is not very clear, so you're not sure, is it a U, is it a A? Well, people take longer in doing that. But the pattern essentially is the same in both. What the take-home is that musicians are way faster than a non-musician. So what about their brain activity? When we look at the brainstem response, we didn't find big differences in the actual amplitude, but we did find differences in the timing. So it seems that the musician have a tighter timing of the vowel representation compared to the non-musician. When we look at the cortex, we found a more substantial difference in the amplitude of the evoked response, around 200 milliseconds, and found also differences around 300-400 milliseconds. What I think is even more telling is if we do a different kind of analysis, where we take the vowels from the two extremes. So these are the two things that perceptually they say they're very different for both cases, musician, non-musician. And if you overlay, this is the trace for the non-musician, if you overlay their brain response, it's almost like there's no difference. We see a little bit later maybe a difference in there, but it's very, very small. When you compare to that, what we see in musician, I think you can appreciate that there's quite a bit of a difference in the N1 and the P2 response and the P3 response. So those are, there's the same material, but their brain is producing very clear dissociable signal that represent these two types of vowels, despite the fact that, again, these vowels are not that different, acoustically speaking. And we also see different pattern of relationship when we look at the musician and the non-musician with respect to the brainstem. When we look at the brainstem, we see that the greater the difference, there's a positive relationship with the brainstem. The microphone one is smaller, faster. When it's too big, it's slower. That's hyper representation, we call it, hyper disinhibition. But when we look at the cortex, we see that the difference between the two waveforms, the greater is the difference, the faster people are in the musician, but we don't see the same pattern in the non-musician. So it appears that the musician, not only they show these differences, but they also see a very nice coupling with the behavior. Whereas the non-musician, we don't see the same level of association between the actual brain response, physiology, and the behavioral manifestation of it. So you may start to wonder, well, how much training is enough? I mean, these individuals that I talked about were older musicians, keep on playing music. What if I play a musical instrument until I'm 20, 25 and I don't play a musical instrument? Do I have some benefit? Does it have a long-lasting effect of this training? This is a question that was asked by Nina Kraus's group. And they test 44 older adults who stopped playing a musical instrument after the age of 25. And so they have people that has no training, a little bit of training, 1 to 3 years, or kind of moderate training, 4 to 14 years. And what they found is a marked difference in the amplitude of the frequency following response, especially at the onset of the phoneme. The take-home message of this slide is that the response is better, because again, the lower score here is better in the moderate musician compared to the low, compared to the no musician. So this is quite exciting, but these findings need to be replicated and extended. But what this is telling us that if you play a musical instrument, or if you go into music lesson when you're a kid, or up to early adulthood, this is going to pay off way down the line when you are 60, 40 years later. And that, I think, is, to me, is quite telling and encouraging, and we should promote music lesson in school as much as we can. So what do we have so far? I showed that music training does improve neural representation of encoding of sounds, and we see things happening at both the subcortical as well as the cortical level in the auditory system. So it appears that music training seems to mitigate some of the change that happen in sensory encoding. So this is consistent with my bottom-up hypothesis that we had at the beginning. We also show that older musicians have neural representation that are more coupled to perception, and that there's some change in more attention-related brain activity, the P2 response, for example, which is larger in older musician than non-musician. So it appears that music training, to some degree, mitigates some of the change that happen in neural indices of top-down controlled processes. So it's a little bit of a mixture of the two. So they have a better central auditory system, but it seems to also have better executive control systems that allow them to complete the task. So lifelong musicianship essentially make older adults better listeners. Now I'd like to switch gear a little bit. What I've been presenting so far are cross-sectional studies. So this is the same kind of, I don't want to say complaint, but criticism that we can receive when I mentioned there was earlier study in younger adults. That is, our older adults who are musicians, well, they're musicians simply because they have a better auditory system and they enroll in these tasks. And therefore, what we're testing is not music per se, it's simply these individual differences, and it happened to be associated with music. So in order to try to circumvent that, people are starting to look at different ways of looking at the question, and we're using longitudinal design and randomized controlled trial and so on. And there have been some work. This is a work that started in the early 2005. Jennifer Bugos is probably unless I am mistaken, probably the first one to start that line of research using a piano lesson. And the findings so far are quite encouraging. So these are older folks who have honestly no music training formation whatsoever, and they come in and they're placed into a music intervention or music lesson and so on. And people are observed improvement in executive function, verbal fluency, verbal memory, and we also seen some benefit in speech and noise perception. Our group was also interested in that sort of benefit of music training, and we test a relatively short intervention program in which we compare music intervention, a visual art intervention program, and a group who has no intervention. So we have people coming in, they were randomly assigned to either the music group, a visual art group, or the control group. They came for 3 months, about 3 times a week, 1 hour lesson. And there's a follow-up. But I'll focus primarily on the post-test today. And the participants receive kind of classroom instruction and the activity of their respective training. It was done by a professional teacher, a music teacher, and a visual art teacher. For the music intervention program, they learn about body percussion, voice, non-pitch instrument. They learn about basic music theory, about melody, harmonic concept, and so on. For the visual art program, they have basic drawing, painting technique. They analyze work of familiar artists, create original painting landscape, and so on. And during the pre and the post-test EEG session, they were presented with 2 different kind of paradigms. One was an auditory outball paradigm, where there was 2 versions of it, where we present pure tone of speech sounds. And there was a visual task, where we use a visual go-no-go task to look more at executive function, but also look at the visual processing itself. We were curious to know, is that intervention is going to do something through visual perception? And when we look at the auditory evoked response, to our surprise, we found some differences in the music group. It's right here. You can see it for the standard and the deviant sounds. We also found, unexpectedly, some differences that were significant in the visual art group, even though they were not doing anything special about sound, but we see marked differences. If you look now at the control, you can see that the trace move really quite nicely between the pre and the post session. There's no difference. So essentially, we see no difference in pre-post with the control, but an increase in response, in cortical evoked response for the visual art and the music group. We also look at oscillatory brain activity because we were concerned that maybe the time lock type of neural analysis that we used was missing on some information that would have been canceled out with the response being jittering. So this is the technical, I won't go in much detail, but oscillatory activity allows us to try to circumvent that to some degree and get another way, another look at those sensory processes. And what we found is that there is a nice difference in the theta power following training comparatively to the group who did not show differences in theta power. So these differences are taken as evidence that somehow visual art and music seems to improve how well they can integrate or encode auditory stimuli. So music and visual art training both associate with enhanced auditory evoked oscillatory activity, and the training-related effect on auditory sensory evoked response suggests some sort of a enhanced efficiency in sensory encoding, which in turn maybe could ease subsequent cognitive operation. But this is something that would need to be tested. What about the go-no-go task? Well, when we look at the reaction time for the GO trial, we don't find any differences before or after treatment and for any of the group. When we look at the no-go accuracy, we see the typical increase in errors for the no-go trial, and we don't see any effect of performance. So it seems that the treatment on the actual behavioral measure of executive function for that particular project was not sensitive enough to detect any differences. What about the brain activity? Well, we found some interesting change in neural activity that was specific to the training program. So here when we compare the music group, we don't see clear, reliable differences in the visual evoked response. But when we look at the visual art, we see substantial changes in the N1 and the P2 response, and no difference. The trace, as you can see, overlay nicely between pre and post for the control group. And when we model the neural activity, where this difference might be coming from, we see changes in source activity in the visual area, in the visual art group, but not in the music group. We also look at the neural index of executive function by comparing the neural activity for the GO and the no-GO trial. And what we found is this large modulation of the P3 response in the music group, but not in the visual art group, and definitely not into the control group. When we apply the same kind of approach, looking at oscillatory activity, we see differences in the theta and beta power as a function of during the GO and no-GO trial. And the difference in theta power was greater in the music than it was in the visual art and the control group. We went one step above. We started asking ourselves, could the training be efficient in changing neural dynamics? By that I mean how the different brain areas work together in performing the task. So to do that, we are placing inside the head different sources. These points in the brain are referring to a point in the source in the brain of the participant. And then using oscillatory-based functional connectivity, we're asking the question, is there a relationship between these different points? And if there's a relationship, then there'll be some sort of a correlation between the phase of the oscillation in, for example, the left frontal gyrus and the auditory area or the visual area and so on. That's the general principle of this analysis. And what we found in the music group is that at pre-test, there's some connectivity happening. There appears to be some regions speaking with each other. But at the post-test, we see an increase in connectivity between these different regions. And when we do a difference between the two, we see that these differences are sustained or significantly different. So this 3-month, very brief music intervention will get people engaged and learning about music was sufficient to introduce some change in neural dynamics that was observable and measurable in older adults. So in summary, a 3-month music and visual art training can yield observable neuroplastic change in the auditory and visual evoked response across a range of different analyses, whether we use a time evoked potential, whether we use oscillatory-based analyses. These training effects, they show some specificity. which is quite important if we want to argue that there's something special about music. We see that visual art training modulates visual evoked response, and we found that music training moderates neural response indexing, response suppression. So our finding provides some hint of a causal relationship between art training, in this case music and visual art, and neuroplastic changes in the sensory system, with some of the neuroplastic change being specific to the training program. We're quite excited about this finding, and these type of findings are encouraging for older population in the sense that what is also telling us that we often forget is that the brain remains plastic way longer than we originally thought. When I went to grad school, the thought was that your brain was plastic until you're 20, 25, and then you were downhill from there. What we're learning today is that it may not be as plastic as it was when it was 16, but my brain now is okay. It is malleable, it can adjust, and it can compensate. And if I'm trained, or I can relearn, I can correct for some of the issues that I may experience. That's a little bit of a nutshell, the general idea. So, to take it together, I start by telling you a little bit of the change that happen as we get older. Our senses are declining, we don't see, we don't hear as well, and so on. And coupled with that, we also experience cognitive decline. And there's a relationship between the sensory domain and the cognitive domain. The greater the sensory deprivation, the worse is the cognitive decline often. I went on to talk a little bit about lifestyle and telling you that there's a wide range of lifestyle choice that you can make. I try to promote music as one of them. Other type of lifestyles are also efficient. Probably using more than one type of intervention would be successful, even more successful. We don't know. This is an open area for research. I went on to talk a little bit about the benefit of music and how music can, to some degree, modify the brain of younger adult, and how it might enhance cognitive reserve, which can then be used at a later interval in time when we get older. I show you some evidence that it seems to be the case because older adults, older musicians do better than the non-musician. And I went on to try to characterize in detail a little bit what are the changes that are taking place. And the data that we have from our group, and I think other group as well, is that the change seems to be complex in nature and include change in the sensory system as well as more executive function. And I finished by telling you a little bit more about the possibility of seeing change in neural dynamics or interaction between different brain regions following intervention and following training. And these might be way to optimize or figuring out what is the best training regimen that we should develop or use in order to optimize having a better brain health as we get older. And as a take-home message, I would argue that music can keep your brain young. And why does it do so? We believe it's, circling back to the first slide on the music, is a very complex, rich activity. It's an activity that engages social interaction, cognitive thinking, attention, memory. It engages the sensory system, auditory, visual, and the motor system. So there's audio, visual, motor coordination, and so on. And with that, I would like to thank many of the colleagues that I had the chance to work with over the years, Ali Moussa, Ben Zendel, Gavin Dillman, Jennifer Gugas, Jing Liu, and Sylvain Moreno, who have been helping out at different stages and different projects that I present today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Dr. Alain, for a great talk. We're going to have a Q&A session, so please ask any questions if you have. We're also going to take questions from the virtual audience, so please type in your question in the Q&A chat room. Thanks.
Be sure to hold the microphone up to your mouth like this, talking to the top. Thank you. Great talk. Did any of the cross-sectional studies look at or control for socioeconomic status? Because we know that music is expensive and lessons and things like that, and then also being in a better school, having fundamental exposure to music lessons and things like that.
Yes, I don't remember, the question was about socioeconomic status and music training and whether there's, I wouldn't say a confound, but how these two variables might interact with one another in explaining the benefit that we observe. On top of my head, I don't remember, but I think it's been done, but I don't have the paper in my head right now. But it's a very good question, a very good possibility, something that we need to take into account.
Doctor, have there been any studies about the impacts of listening to music? We get that question a lot about listening to music. And by listening, I assume there's a difference between being a passive listener and a curious listener. But have there been any studies on whether that can rise to the level of musical training to have this kind of impact?
That's a great question. And it's a very fun one to try to tackle. I have an anecdote. Tough one to say. I have a little story. We have a friend of mine who's I would call him an audiophile. He's the kind of person who would create in his basement literally a room that is insulated and soundproof, and he got all the speakers around, and he listened to symphony in the center, and he's explaining his very fancy computer that the surround system is incredible. That sort of individual, I would love to see them in my lab, because I'm sure they would have superior performance in many tasks. We also have someone, a friend, whose partner is blind. And so they cannot watch book together, so they listen to audiobook. But her husband is blind, so he's been listening to audiobook for many years, and he tends to crank the speed very, very high. And he gave us a demonstration of how fast he listened to books. And I can tell you, he cannot identify anything. He was gibberish. So the wife trained herself to the audiobook. So she started cranking the speed. And she gave us an example of how, well, she can hear the book, and I could not understand. So we said, well, your friend is coming to my lab, we're going to put you in the sound booth. And she did. And she was superior performance. She was doing extremely well. We don't know. Those are just one of those. And but it was amazing. So I would say yes. And more our group and other group is starting to look at the impact of music listening. We are interested in see to what extent music may engage some areas that are critical for memory, or kind of bypass some of the areas that are affected by Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment, and can facilitate some of the memory. So those are the kind of things that our group are doing, other groups are doing as well.
Very elegant research, thank you. So I'm curious, do you think it's the temporal training, like someone that does singing also might have similar effects as an instrument? If thinking that the voice may be an instrument, and it's really the temporal training that you're fine-tuning the neural system to make it better.
This is where we were discussing about this morning. In fact, I think this is where the research we are right now. We are starting asking questions. Is there really dramatic differences whether you're using voice? We know there's benefit if you're in a choir and if you're not. So engagement, if you like to sing, go. It works. And it will boost, and it's a good activity. How does it compare to playing the violin, the piano, the trombone? We don't know. Are they really that big of a difference? My feeling is that probably not. But it just would be my educated guess.
Well, I'd love to do some research with you and see the difference, not just on the specific processes that may be fine-tuned, but really more holistic. Our measure of brain health index to see if people, when they do engage in music, that they actually become more socially connected, emotional well-being, to look at it from not just does my brain remember better, but really does it make my wisdom make me a productive part of society. So I'm going to talk to you about that later.
All right, we have a couple of questions from the virtual audience. So let me read some of those. So how about the effects of musical training for those who started their training after age 25 or later in adult career, especially in older people?
This is where there's been more research in the past, I'd say 10 years, and the results are very encouraging. People who have no music background, who start music lessons just as a hobby, when after retirement, they're looking for something to do and they don't want to sit on the couch, and they jump in. And there's programs now that are geared toward older adults who are retirees or who wants to start music. And it's done in the music ensemble. And there it speaks maybe to the earlier question that there's something special about music because it's not done individually. Often it's done in a group. Many of us play a musical instrument. We played in a band when we were kids. I don't know if we call that music, but we did play. But when you play music and it starts to sound good, when you're in sync, it's a feeling that is very, very strong. And we do not know how that play into the benefit. How does it play in the whole story?
Yeah, great. Other question is, what is the relevance of the type of music, such as classical, pop, vocal instrument, and differences?
In terms of the playing, or in terms of
In
listening?
terms of the brain ability, if any differences in participating in different type of genre or instrument?
For the music playing, I don't think there's been a lot of report seeing differences between whether you train classical and you play classical versus being more rock music in terms of the difference. There's been work done looking at amateur musicians, but that looked more like at the dose effect, how much training do you have. But the type of activity, not. In terms of music listening, there's been claims a long time ago about some benefit of classical music that can boost your memory. And these claims have been kind of shy aside of it, that it was not sustained. It was not very hard evidence for that. But those are remaining questions. Things are changing, and the way we quantify brain activity today is different than when these studies were done maybe 20 years ago. So I think we need to keep an open mind and explore different things before we have a final conclusion.
Great.
Hi. How do we know that the cause is actually music and not the lifestyle choices common to musicians like marijuana consumption or sexual frequency or tax evasion or whatever?
This is a $2,000 question. What we hope is that the tax evasion, the other things and things, is kind of randomized in both groups. And it's not systematic. So.
Or those sexual characteristics or behaviors?
Not that I'm aware of. People are trying more and more to get a better characteristic of their sample on various degrees, socioeconomic status and other things, other lifestyle. Physical activity would be another one. I mean, I would be intrigued, and I think I came across one report which compared music intervention and physical activity. So, I mean, again, those who play a musical instrument, who are into music, maybe have higher income. This could be the same group of individuals who also happen to have a better diet, also have a tendency to do more exercise. So you start, well, this is get complicated. what is what. But I think this is we are there. If we go back, if we look from a historical perspective, and I think this is where we need to place ourselves. If we, 10 years ago, there was a lot of doubt. People didn't think music had, so what? Today, I think the evidence are pretty good. Now the question has changed, and it's good. It's changing, and we're refining the question, and we're getting more precise in the type of answer that we can generate.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Alain. So we have a little bit of a closing remark. So I mentioned the Brain Health Project at the beginning. So we have recently launched the largest scale landmark study called the Brain Health Project, which will help people everywhere get proactive about maintaining and improving their brain health and performance. So if you are interested in learning more about the Brain Health Project and possibly participating in, please scan the QR code with your phone on the screen or visit the brainhealthproject.org. Once again, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on February 17th with Dr. Michael Kilgar from Texas Biomedical Device Center. He will discuss promoting recovery in people with chronic PTSD, stroke, or spinal cord injury. Thank you so much.